and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Obus Partners. I'm your host, Tim McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about how hard is it to get insurance for flood-prone properties. Now, this actually comes from a listener of the show, Helen, who messaged in and said that she'd just been off to a talk by the Auckland Property Investors Association, and the chief economist from Kiwi Bank was there talking about that with global warming and more high-risk weather events, getting insurance for certain properties can become a bit harder. And she said, can you talk to us a little about this? How tricky is it going to get over the next couple of decades to get insurance for higher risk properties? And it's quite funny that you should mention this, because I was recently on Radio New Zealand talking about Westport, which is a small little town on the west coast of the South Island. And did you know there are plans, and there's a vote coming up, maybe it's already happened by the time we release this, to relocate Westport a kilometre down the road.
Really? Because of erosion and stuff?
It's because there are so many floods that go on in Westport. And in fact, on Radio New Zealand, we had a local on the show who moved down from Auckland to little old Westport.
Imagine moving from Auckland to Westport.
Yeah, well, he actually quite liked it.
Yeah.
And he said, well, you know, within, I think it was a couple of months of moving into a house down there, I think it was a rental at the time, whole place got flooded out in 2021. And so there's this discussion about, well, maybe we'll open up some land and we'll slowly migrate the town kilometre down the road so that we can get away from this. And that's kind of leads into this question about, okay, well, if there's a lot more flooding in certain areas, if we've built cities in the quote unquote wrong location because they're so close to the water or that they're flood prone, am I still going to be able to get insurance in the future? And I know it's quite a nerdy question, but quite an important one to talk about. And the other reason why I wanted to talk about this, Andrew, is I said to that guy, well, hang on a second. If you're going to sell your property in Westport at the moment to go and buy a section down the road on build on it, and
who's
build
going to
on
buy
it,
it?
who's going to buy your land?
Yeah.
And he said to me, well, you know, I moved down here from Auckland and bought somebody's land, so maybe somebody will come down. I'm like, ain't nobody buying your land or your property off you if it's known to be flood prone and everybody's moving down the road.
So that's what I was wondering when you were telling me about this. So will the council buy this land? Is that the plan?
Well, no, the council doesn't have the money to do that. So anyway, that's something
okay,
we'll have to come back in a different episode and talk about the lovely people of Westport. But specifically, how do people make sure they're not buying in a flood-prone area, Andrew?
So I think the most important thing you do is you want to jump online and use some of the tools online. So Auckland, for example, after the Auckland floods, the Auckland Council released an excellent map which basically shows you the at-risk zones. Now, you might already own a property in an at-risk zone, or you might be buying a property there and you're going to manage that risk, but you can absolutely go on here, type in your address and look at where the risk areas are. And it's not just Auckland that has this, it's just that's the most recently released and
probably the best one, actually.
But if you jump on the Christchurch City Council website, you'll be able to find one similar. I'm sure that's the case for most regions.
Yeah, I remember we did an episode directly after the Auckland floods when Auckland Council had just released this map. Even Invercargill Council has one.
What do you mean, even Invercargill?
Well,
poor old Invercargill.
Well, it's a small little city at the bottom of the South Island. I mean, lovely for everybody who lives in Invercargill. Never say anything bad about Invercargill.
So in terms of tools,
but the map's I'm not sure if we'll leave that in, David.
So I think that using online tools, that's a great start. The other thing you want to do is you want to check the LIM if you're buying a property. Now, the LIM is the Land Information Memorandum, and it's basically a document from the council which will outline the risks to do with that land. So if there's erosion, if it's in a mass movement area, if there's flood issues there, and or get the actual property file. And the property file, if it's an existing property, is going to have things like the resource consent, the building consent, any consents done with works to the property, and have a good look through that to see if there's any risks outlined.
Yeah, it's quite funny. I saw on Reddit somebody saying, what do you think about buying in a flood-prone area? And one of my favourite comments is, unless your first name is Noah and you have good carpentry skills, look elsewhere. Now, that's actually quite funny, but also not true, because we've also got to understand, what is a floodplain? What does that actually mean? And the technical definition of a floodplain is if there is a 1% chance of a flood happening per year. So often quite a low chance. But what's important to understand is even if your property is built in a floodplain or in a flood prone area, that does not necessarily mean that your insurance is going to be more expensive because it all depends on how your property is being built. So, one of the really interesting changes in the insurance industry is in the past, we used to have more of a community based insurance, which is the insurance companies would look at a broad area, maybe a suburb, and say, okay, what's the average risk? Okay, we will factor in the average risk for every single property. Now it's going to a more address by address basis. So if Andrew's got a high risk property and I've got a low risk property and we're built right next to each other, Andrew's going to pay way more insurance. I'm no longer having to pay for any of Andrew's risk because he's the one who bought that specific property. Now, this becomes quite important because you could have a property in a flood prone area that is built to modern standards. So it's built well off the ground. It's built to withstand even a 200-year flood. Well, you're probably going to pay less for your insurance compared to if it was a property that was built in the 1950s. It's built really close to the ground, not that high at all. Well, if you've bought that sort of property, you're probably more at risk of making a claim if there is a large flood. The insurance companies know this because they've got actuaries working for them, real hefty data nerds working for them who calculate all of these sorts of things. And because of that, you're probably going to pay for that higher insurance. So that higher insurance premium. So even if you jump onto one of these websites, you say, oh, wow, I'm potentially in a floodplain or a flood prone area. Well, just remember, so is in some cities, half the city is in a flood prone area. A lot of whether you're going to pay more for your insurance or not, or whether you're particularly high risk or not, depends on how your house is built as well. And what's really interesting is Treasury have put out some numbers looking at what is the chance you're actually able to get insurance.
Yeah, and this is a really interesting table. And obviously, you can't see this if you're listening on the podcast, but if you want to see the actual table, jump online and watch this on YouTube. There are, let's take Christchurch, for example. There are actually quite a lot of areas where floods are a high risk in Christchurch. Now, does that mean you can't get insurance? No, it doesn't. Doesn't necessarily. It means that it's probably going to be a bit more complicated. So with a property that isn't in a high risk area, you can jump online and you can get an insurance policy relatively easily. But if you're at a high risk location, it becomes a lot more complicated to get insurance.
Yeah, so what Treasury's done is they hired this company called Finity Consulting, and they looked at about 1,400 different properties in the country. And then on an ongoing basis, they'd jump online and see if you actually could just get an online insurance quote from 2 or more insurers. So this was kind of their baseline to see, is it easy to get insurance? Is it not easy to get insurance? And one thing that's actually quite fascinating, if we look at Christchurch CBD, when you even look at properties with no flood risk, only 10% of those within their sample were able to jump on to 2 or more insurers and just get a quote online. For 90% of properties, even with no flood risk, you had to call up the company. Now compare that to Blenheim. Every single property that had no flood risk, you just call them up. All good, really easy. And so there's probably some issues here in Christchurch around seismic issues as well.
That was going to be my question, because if you jump online and you chuck in one of these addresses that may or may not have an issue with floods, you're probably going to be captured by the seismic considerations of earthquakes in Christchurch.
Yeah, but even if we look somewhere else, and let's take a look at Wellington. So Miramar in Wellington, if your property is considered high flood risk, it's got high risk of flooding, 70% of those properties, you can still jump on to 2 or more insurance companies and actually go ahead and get that online quote straight away. So that's a bit of a litmus test about how easy or how difficult is it to get insurance. And it is really interesting how it does change based on where your property is located. If your property is in Cambridge, look, whether it's got a high level of flood risk or not, it's pretty easy to get insurance online. Not really too much to worry about. If your property's in Christchurch, bit more to worry about. If your property's in Wellington, maybe a little bit more to worry about. But if you're in Motueka, oh, don't worry, mate. 100% of properties within the data set even if it had high or medium flood risk, could still get that online insurance quote. So it kind of depends on where your property is based. And the big question is, okay, if the insurance companies are now taking an address by address kind of view on how much they're going to charge you, if I'm in a more flood prone area, if I'm at a higher risk of flooding, how much more is my house insurance going to cost me?
So if we look at their same properties from that same report, of the properties that they looked at, 92% of them could get an online quote, and 25% of those that were quoted had an additional flood premium of at least $250. So roughly you're going to pay at least another $5 per week. Now, for some of the more extreme cases where there was a really high risk, the flood premium was up to $4,500 on top of the normal premium.
So it's like 80 to 85 bucks a week.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. The other thing that you might see is there might be a higher excess that you pay. So it might be that, okay, you might pay, somewhat more of a premium, but then they're also going to charge you a higher level of excess in the event that you make a claim.
It is important to say, though, that that $4,500 was like an outlier. The bulk of that extra amount that you pay is under $1,000 per year. So somewhere between an extra $5 to $20 a week. If your property is assessed as being a higher risk of flooding, then that's how much extra you're going to pay. But you can challenge this. So it's really interesting. There was a family in Napier who went on and they looked at the council's flood risk classification for the property. Now, because their property was deemed as higher risk of flooding, the homeowner ended up going to council and saying, hey, hang on. It's only my driveway that is in the flood-prone area. My actual house isn't. So that means that the likelihood that I'm going to make an insurance claim because my house has got flooded is very low because it's only my driveway. So the insurance company wanted to increase his insurance from about $5,500 a year to almost $8,000, about an extra $1,500 a year.
That's a lot. I mean, it was high to begin with, to be honest.
Yeah, and so what he did, well, it had actually been jumped up a couple of times because of that assessment. So he calls up the council, challenges the fact that, well, my house is actually not at a flood-prone area, ended up saving about $1,000 a year on their insurance bill. But Andrew, one question I've got is it fair that we're moving to this kind of away from the community-based pricing model to a more individual address-by-address model?
I think yes and no. I mean, if you think about the fact that insurance kind of is all about spreading the risk amongst a group of people, right? But if you are going to buy something that is more risky and you do that with your eyes open, then yeah, I think it is fair that you pay an extra premium on top of your normal premium, because why should Ed pay for my desire to live on the hill?
Yeah, well, the fact is that Tower Insurance went out and they surveyed a bunch of Aucklanders. 73% of people thought this was fair. But what it will do, it will change behaviour. So in the past, if you're under a community-based insurance kind of model, you go and buy a house, you see what the insurance is. You might have been on a cliff and you might have thought, oh, well, the insurance isn't that much because you weren't paying for the extra risk you were taking on that was being spread across everyone. Now that we're moving to that more address-by-address model, you might find that you go to buy a house or you go to sell a house that has some of these risks, and buyers don't want to pay quite as much because now they're realizing, oh, well, if my property is by a cliff, or, oh, well, if my property is in a flood-prone area and hasn't been built to modern standards, then this is going to be quite a bit of risk. I'm going to be paying more in insurance. I'm going to factor that in to the price that I offer. And I think that is fair. But what is going to be tough for some people, especially sellers who didn't take that risk into account when they first bought those properties, they might find that, I'm not able to sell my property for as much compared to if it didn't have that specific risk. So there'll be a change in buying behavior. Right, let's wrap it up there. But please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. And if you want to see some of the graphs, some of the tables we're talking about on the show while you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, just Google Opus Partners YouTube. It'll be the first thing that comes up. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Knight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.